Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. It was on this date 150 years ago that President Abraham Lincoln delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. Lincoln was in Pennsylvania on November 19, 1863, where he gave his Gettysburg Address. In just a moment, we'll join Vermont Civil War historian in Gettysburg for a remembrance of that famous speech. But we begin with another story from Howard, the infamous Sleeping Sentinel.
Here east of Groton along Route 302 stands a monument to a man who was probably the most famous private in all the Civil War, William Scott. A member of the 3rd Vermont Regiment, he was 18 when he went off to war. Early on, the regiment was stationed outside Washington in Georgetown. He was on sentry duty, and they found him asleep. He was court-martialed for that, and he pleaded not guilty, but still, after deliberations, the court-martial sentenced him to death by firing squad. They brought him out a few days later with the regiment assembled, tied him to a post, and he expected to hear his death warrant read. He was ashen-faced and trembling when he heard the words that he had been pardoned. He became known as the Sleeping Sentinel, and he went back to duty. Abraham Lincoln was aware of his case. Appeals had been made to Lincoln to spare his life. Looking back at it all, and looking at some sources like Wheelock Vasey, who was on the court-martial, it now seems there was a plot afoot to scare the daylights out of Union privates early in the war by almost killing one of them. Apparently it worked. Just south of St. Johnsbury, along the Passumpsic River, down here where Interstates 91 and 93 now meet, that level area was once the St. Johnsbury Fairgrounds. To the fairgrounds in the summer of 1861 came 1,000 Vermont men to drill and form the 3rd Vermont Regiment. One of those men was William Scott. This marker is right in the middle of the fairgrounds, which was renamed Camp Baxter when the soldiers got here. Here they drilled, and here William Scott became a soldier. A friend of his said he was a big, awkward country boy whose heart was as big as he was. He had trouble learning to march, kept kicking the foot of the man in front of him. Days later, 10,000 people gathered here to see the women of St. Johnsbury present a homemade flag to the regiment. Governor Erastus Fairbanks spoke. And then a few days after that, the regiment marched down the road to St. Johnsbury on their way to war. Down this road they came, which was lined with people, the 3rd Vermont, William Scott doing the best he could to keep in step. At the depot, a huge crowd was gathered, most cheering, some weeping, as the regiment boarded the train for Washington, D.C. and the war zone. The sparing of the Sleeping Sentinel's life was big news. It was in all the newspapers. Scott was briefly famous. The winter passed in camp. Scott rode home to Groton about how he wished he could be home and how he'd like some maple sugar. Then war began. George Brinton McClellan took his Army of the Potomac down the Virginia Peninsula and began to move against Richmond. But lo and behold, the Army came upon the Warwick River, which didn't show on their maps. It looked much like this orange pond. About this wide, it had been dammed by the Confederates, and on the far side, the Confederates had constructed earthworks, formidable earthworks and rifle pits. On the 16th of April, General McClellan came along and ordered the Vermonters to wade across that pond and attack those earthworks. The 3rd Vermont were the first to go, and as they waded into the water, William Scott was riddled with bullets. But they kept on across the pond, captured the earthworks, and held them until driven away by a Confederate counterattack. By the end of the day, 148 Vermonters had been shot. 65 of them would die. The war had really begun for Vermont. Vermont learned what war was all about. So the Vermonters had seen their first real heavy combat. Soon would come Savage's Station and bigger casualties. And down the road, of course, was Gettysburg and Wilderness and Cedar Creek and finally Petersburg and Appomattox. And the final cost would be some 6,000 Vermont lives. Right smack in the middle of Groton is the town Civil War monument with an astonishing number of names of local lads who served in the Civil War. The Scott boys' names are on here. At the time of the Civil War, there was a store here. Local people gathered here to get the latest war news. I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Scott took the buckboard 4 miles down to get that news night after night. Was it here that he learned of William's death? Maybe Carl Sandburg said it best. William Scott, among the fresh growths and blooms of a Virginia springtime at Lee's Mills, took the burning messages of 6 bullets into his body. All he could give Lincoln or his country or his God was now given. Civil War combat had begun for the Vermonters.
William Scott was not the only member of his family to die in the Civil War. Scott had 3 brothers who were also killed in combat. Our next segment centers on this date in history. 150 years ago today, President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. For the story and the address, we now join Howard Coffin in Gettysburg.
The Battle of Gettysburg produced more than 50,000 casualties. The houses, the churches, all the buildings in Gettysburg seemed to be filled with them. To care for the wounded, the Union Army brought Major Henry James, an experienced surgeon, to oversee their care, and he came from Waterbury, Vermont. But what to do with the dead? The dead were everywhere. They lay on the slope of Little Round Top, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had launched his bayonet charge to save the Union line on the 2nd day. They were all over Plum Run Valley, which suddenly gained the name the Valley of Death. They were in Devil's Den among the boulders and the rocks. They were all over the wheat field, where long lines of battle had stood at almost point-blank range on a hot July afternoon and slaughtered each other. The dead were everywhere. The Confederates were hastily buried in mass graves, but what about the Union soldiers? They were placed in individual graves, and most of their graves were marked with rude headboards. But what to do overall? The Gettysburg people addressed the problem. They formed a committee and they decided to create a national cemetery, and they wanted to put it on Cemetery Hill. It was approved, and a plan was made to dedicate the cemetery on the 19th of November, 1863. And to highlight the thing, they decided to invite to Gettysburg the most influential, famous orator in all of America, Edward Everett of Massachusetts, former president of Harvard and governor of the state. And then, as an afterthought, they decided it would be nice to have a few appropriate remarks from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's staff at the White House wanted him to come to Gettysburg by train the morning of the event. But Lincoln said no, he'd go the day before on the 18th. He wanted to be sure he got here. The rails were going to be busy with special trains going to Gettysburg. This was a big event. Why was Lincoln so eager to be here? He didn't want to miss it because he had some things he wanted to say to the country. The war was not going well. Yes, there had been a victory of sorts at Gettysburg, but Lee's army had not been destroyed. Lee was back in Virginia on the loose. Lincoln knew the war would go into the next year. There was so much fighting and bloodshed ahead. There were some things he wanted to say. So he got here at 5 o'clock on the afternoon before the event. He was met here by David Wills, the Gettysburg lawyer, who was the moving force behind the cemetery. And Wells escorted him just up the street to the square where Wills's house stood, where Lincoln would spend the night. The day of the great event, Lincoln came in a procession from the Wills house out to the cemetery to the speaking platform, which was located at the top of the hill up beyond that fence. The cemetery was still under construction. There were open graves and they were keeping the crowds out. And what a crowd there was, probably 20,000 people, including many men who had fought here. Edward Everett spoke first, and he spoke for 2 hours as he was expected to do, and he gave a magnificent report on what the battle had been all about, and he was careful to mention Stannard's Vermonters. A hush came over the crowd after the long applause for Everett, and then Lincoln walked to the speaker's stand with a few small papers in his hand. He looked out across the valley where all of this had happened, and he began to speak. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The applause for Lincoln went on and on. And then the 20,000 people went away, but really they have never stopped coming to Gettysburg, which has become the shrine of the American Civil War.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX-TV.